12 states. That's how many adopted Sharia law in northern Nigeria, and almost none of them asked their people to vote on it. But here's what nobody is saying out loud. The men who pushed hardest for Sharia in Nigeria were not clerics, they were governors, politicians, men with Swiss bank accounts and election debts to pay. So ask yourself, when a politician wrapped himself in religion right before a vote, right before a census, right before revenue allocation is decided, is that faith talking or is that strategy? Because when you follow the money behind Sharia in Nigeria, the trail doesn't end in a mosque, it ends in Abuja. Stay with me because what I'm about to show you completely reframes this story. Before we go deeper, if you're just finding Niger Newsfeed, welcome. This channel exists to break down what's really happening in Nigerian politics without the noise, without the spin. Hit subscribe and stay with me because this one gets interesting. Let's establish exactly what we're talking about. Between 1999 and 2001, right after Nigeria returned to democratic rule, 12 states in the northwest and northeast rapidly adopted Sharia as their legal framework, not just for personal matters like marriage and inheritance, which was already customary, full criminal Sharia. Amputation for theft, death by stoning for adultery, public flogging. The timing matters. Nigeria had just held its first civilian elections after 16 years of military rule. The country was raw, unstable, and desperate for legitimacy. The first governor to move was Ahmed Sani Yarima of Zamfara State, October 1999. Within months, 11 other states followed. Some governors moved so fast, their own state assemblies barely had time to debate it. Now, why does this matter today, in 2025? Because the debate never actually ended. It just went quiet. Recent court cases challenging Sharia sentences, growing pressure from human rights groups, fresh conversations about constitutional review, and a new generation of northern youth asking questions their parents weren't allowed to ask, all of this has cracked the topic back open. And this time, people are asking a different question. Not should Sharia exist, but who actually put it there and what did they get in return? I'll name names before this video is done, but first, you need to understand the structure they were working inside because that's what made this possible. Here's what the Nigerian Constitution actually says, and it's worth reading carefully because there's a deliberate gap that was exploited. Section 10 of the 1999 Constitution is unambiguous. The government of the federation or of a state shall not adopt any religion as a state religion. Full stop. Nigeria is constitutionally secular. But Section 277 gives Sharia courts jurisdiction over personal law matters, family and inheritance for Muslims who consent to that jurisdiction. That's the gap. And when governors in 1999 extended Sharia beyond personal matters into criminal law, they did not amend the constitution. They simply acted, and nobody stopped them. Why? Because the federal government under Obasanjo calculated correctly that challenging Sharia directly would trigger a political and possibly violent crisis, so the federal government blinked. The Supreme Court was never asked for a definitive ruling. No landmark case went all the way. The legal ambiguity was left standing, not by accident, but by political convenience. What that means is this. Sharia's expansion in the north was not primarily a legal event. It was a political event dressed in legal language. And the institutions that should have checked it chose not to. That's the game board. Now let's talk about who was playing and what they were actually after.
This is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because once you understand the political logic, religion starts to look less like the cause and more like the cover. First, the electoral math. 1999 was a new democracy. Politicians needed mass mobilization, fast, without the infrastructure or track record to earn loyalty on policy. Religion is the most powerful mobilization tool in human history. It's free, it's emotional, and it doesn't require you to fix the roads. Governors who declared Sharia weren't just making a religious statement. They were making a political calculation. Declare Sharia, become untouchable. Anyone who challenged you became an enemy of Islam. That's a shield. That's incumbency armor built in a single press conference. Second, the revenue allocation war. Here is the part that almost nobody connects publicly. In 1999-2000, Nigeria was in the middle of a fierce battle over how oil revenue gets split between the federal government and the states. Southern governors, particularly in the Niger Delta, were pushing hard for derivation, the idea that states where oil is extracted should get a bigger share. Northern states, which produce very little oil, stood to lose significantly if derivation increased. Their governors needed leverage. They needed the federal government to stay nervous, stay distracted, stay in negotiation mode. A Sharia crisis in 12 states threatening national unity is extraordinarily useful leverage in a revenue negotiation. You don't have to say it out loud. The message is understood. Third, the debt to the masses. The northern political elite had a problem in 1999. After years of military rule dominated by northern generals who delivered very little for ordinary northern people, there was genuine anger on the ground. People were poor. Infrastructure was broken. Boko Haram didn't exist yet, but the frustration that would eventually feed it was already there. Sharia was, in part, a pressure valve. Give the people something that feels like justice, something that feels like identity and dignity, even if the hospitals are still empty and the schools still have no roofs. Now, who were the silent players? Not all of this was driven from within Nigeria. There is documented evidence, and I'm being careful here to say documented, of foreign funding flowing into northern Nigeria during this period to support Islamic institutions, scholarships, and infrastructure. Some of that money came with ideological strings attached. Saudi Arabia's export of Wahhabist education through the 1980s and 1990s had already reshaped the religious landscape in the north before 1999. By the time governors were declaring Sharia, they were partly responding to a population that had already been moved in that direction by foreign money that had been flowing for 2 decades. That's not a conspiracy. That's a documented pattern across multiple African and Asian countries during the same period. The timeline of moves. 1999. Yarima declares Sharia in Zamfara. Federal government does not respond. 2000. 11 states follow. Riots break out in Kaduna. Over 2,000 people die. 2002. The Amina Lawal case, a woman sentenced to death by stoning for adultery, draws international attention. The sentence is later overturned. 2009. Boko Haram launches its armed insurgency, explicitly citing the failure of both Sharia implementation and the Nigerian state. 2015 to 2023, the Sharia debate quietly resurfaces in constitutional review discussions. 2024 to 2025, new court cases, new voices, and a new generation asking who built this system and why. The through line is this: Sharia in Nigeria was deployed strategically at a specific historical moment by political actors who needed a tool. The sincerely religious people who supported it were not wrong to want a system rooted in their values, but the men who gave it to them had other things on their minds. Now, if what I just laid out surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know your take before we get to the part that changes the whole picture. Because coming up, I'm going to show you how this same playbook is still being used today. Different issue, same architecture. Pull back from the politics for a moment and look at what this has actually cost Nigeria. On national unity, the Sharia declarations of 1999-2001 accelerated a psychological partition of the country that has never fully healed. Not because Christianity and Islam cannot coexist, they have in Nigeria for over a century, but because the political weaponization of religion made every interfaith tension feel existential. Once politicians discovered that religion was their most reliable mobilization tool, they never stopped using it. On the economy, 12 states operating under a separate legal framework created an investment barrier that foreign businesses still cite today. Legal uncertainty, particularly around contract enforcement and what courts have jurisdiction over commercial disputes, has suppressed economic activity in the north for over 2 decades. The ordinary people Sharia was supposed to protect are among Nigeria's poorest citizens. On security, this is the most devastating consequence. Boko Haram did not emerge from nowhere.
Its founding ideology argued that the Sharia imposed by politicians was fake, a political performance, not genuine Islamic governance. Mohammed Yusuf, Boko Haram's founder, explicitly used the hypocrisy of Sharia governors who drank alcohol privately, sent their children abroad, and enriched themselves through corruption as a recruiting argument. The political manipulation of religion created a vacuum, and an extremist movement filled it. That is not a conspiracy, that is cause and effect. This story doesn't stay inside Nigeria's borders, and it never did. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states funded Islamic institutions across northern Nigeria throughout the 1980s and 1990s. This was part of a broader geopolitical effort to counter Iranian influence after the 1979 revolution and to spread a more conservative Sunni framework globally. Nigerian students were given scholarships, mosques and schools were built. By the time 1999 arrived, the groundwork had already been laid. The United States and United Kingdom watched the Sharia declarations nervously but chose not to intervene directly, prioritizing oil access and counter-terrorism cooperation over human rights pressure. The Amina Lawal case forced some public statements but no serious diplomatic consequences for the governors involved. The African Union and ECOWAS took no meaningful action. Their non-interference doctrine combined with the political sensitivity of religious law meant that regional bodies simply looked away. For the diaspora, understand that what happened in northern Nigeria was not isolated. It was part of a global pattern of foreign money shaping local religious movements, of democratic transitions being hijacked by identity politics before institutions could stabilize, and of great powers treating African nations as chess pieces rather than sovereign actors. The lesson for Nigeria is that domestic political dysfunction can always find foreign sponsors willing to fund the chaos.
Let me address what people get wrong, including people on both sides of this debate. Misconception 1. Sharia is purely a religious matter, and outsiders should stay out of it. The moment criminal law, including sentences that affect non-Muslims and that override federal constitutional rights, gets involved, it becomes a governance matter. You cannot separate the two. The Nigerian constitution does not have a carve-out for religious law in the criminal domain. This isn't an opinion, it's the text. Misconception 2. Sharia was forced on the north by extremists. This is incorrect, and it actually lets the real actors off the hook. The governors who implemented Sharia were elected democratic officials. Yarima was not a cleric, he was a politician who saw an opportunity. The responsibility lies with democratic actors making democratic choices, which also means democratic accountability is the appropriate response. Misconception 3. This is a northern problem. Southern Nigeria has its own version of this exact dynamic. Politicians who deploy ethnicity, who fund religious organizations for political loyalty, who use traditional rulers as vote delivery mechanisms, the architecture is identical, the costume is different. Anyone in the South celebrating the North's political manipulation of religion should look carefully at what's happening in their own states. The most persistent argument from defenders of Sharia implementation is that ordinary people genuinely wanted it, that it represented a democratic expression of values in the absence of a functional state. That argument has real weight. When courts don't work, when police extort you, when there is no justice, people will accept any system that promises order. That genuine desperation was real, but it was also exploited deliberately by people who had no intention of building the just society they promised. What happens next? Here's what to watch. Most likely near term, the conversation stays at the level of commentary and social media. Politicians in both the North and South have no incentive to formally resolve the constitutional ambiguity. It remains useful to too many people. Expect the issue to surface again around the next election cycle as a mobilization tool. Watch for this signal. If any governor or presidential aspirant in the North begins publicly distancing themselves from Sharia, not for religious reasons, but as a governance reform argument, that will tell you a generational shift is happening in the northern political elite.
A new cohort of northern professionals and young people are increasingly frustrated with how religion has been used to distract from basic governance failures. Watch for this too. Legal challenges to Sharia criminal jurisdiction that are actually taken seriously at the Supreme Court level. This has been avoided for over 20 years. If a case makes it through, it will force the constitutional question that everyone has been running from. Best case, a frank national conversation led from within the North, not imposed from outside, that separates sincere Islamic values from the political machinery that hijacked them. Countries like Morocco and Indonesia have navigated this. It's not impossible. Worst case, the constitutional ambiguity remains. Political actors continue exploiting religious identity, economic stagnation deepens resentment in the north, and the conditions that gave Boko Haram its recruiting pool regenerate with or without that specific organization. The window for course correction exists, but it requires political courage from actors who have so far found cowardice far more profitable. Let me bring this back to where we started. I asked you, when a politician wraps himself in religion right before an election, right before a revenue fight, right before power is on the line, is that faith or is that strategy? By now you have the answer. The sponsors of Sharia in Nigeria were not primarily driven by theology. They were driven by political survival, electoral calculation, revenue leverage, and in some cases, foreign money looking for influence. The ordinary people who believed in it, who wanted justice and dignity and a system that reflected their values were real. Their frustration was legitimate, but they were handed a performance, not a solution. And the evidence is in the results. 25 years later, the 12 Sharia states include some of the highest poverty rates, lowest education indicators, and most severe security crises anywhere in Nigeria. The system served the people who built it. It did not serve the people it claimed to protect. That's not a religious verdict. That's a governance verdict. What do you think? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely want to know if you see this differently. If this breakdown gave you clarity on what's really going on, do me a favor. Share it with one person who needs to understand this. Like the video, subscribe to Naija News Feed, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay sharp.